The rain fell in relentless sheets, splattering against the sleek, black luxury car as it sped through the city streets. Inside, Victor West gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, eyes narrowed in concentration. His phone buzzed for the fourth time in 10 minutes, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on the meeting ahead. This was the deal of a lifetime, one that would secure his name among the elite in the corporate world. Missing this meeting wasn't an option. As the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, the lights of the city blurred into streaks of neon and headlights. The rainstorm had caught everyone off guard, turning the usually bustling metropolis into a chaotic mess of gridlocked traffic and pedestrians huddling under shop awnings. Victor glanced at the clock on the dashboard. He had only 20 minutes left to get across town. "Perfect," he muttered, his frustration growing. His assistant's voice rang in his mind. "Be on time, Victor. This deal is everything." His hands tightened on the wheel. The world outside felt distant, as if separated by an invisible wall of success. He had worked for years to build that wall, brick by brick, cutting off everything that reminded him of the life he had escaped. Poverty, struggle, failure. He had buried those memories deep beneath the layers of his tailored suits and luxury lifestyle. Another buzz from his phone. Victor gritted his teeth and reached for it, his patience wearing thin. The screen lit up with a message from his assistant. "ETA?" they're asking. Victor exhaled sharply and typed back. 5 minutes. Traffic's bad. He tossed the phone aside, glancing up just in time to slam on the brakes. His car screeched to a halt, inches from a figure stumbling into the street. A man, drenched from head to toe, clutching a baby to his chest. For a split second, the world stopped. Victor's pulse raced as he stared at the man through the rain-slicked windshield. The man was hunched over, shielding the baby from the downpour, his clothes little more than rags. Victor's first instinct was to roll down the window and yell, but something held him back. He watched unmoving as the man staggered toward the sidewalk, disappearing into the shadows of a nearby alley. The rain continued to pound on the car, and Victor's heart hammered in his chest. The beggar's image lingered in his mind, unsettling him in a way he couldn't explain. He shook his head, clearing the thought, and slammed the car back into gear. He had a meeting to get to. Victor forced himself to focus on the road again, but the unsettling image of the man and the baby gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had seen beggars before. This city was full of them, huddled in corners, eyes hollow, holding out hands that were often ignored by the rush of people who passed by. Yet, something about this encounter felt different. It was as if a small crack had appeared in the carefully built walls around his life, a reminder of the world he had worked so hard to forget. "Just focus," he muttered, shaking off the thought. The rain intensified, hammering against the car roof like nails. Victor drove on, weaving through the streets with a practiced precision. The meeting was all that mattered now. He'd be on time, nail the presentation, and close the deal. That was the plan. Nothing else. But then, a flicker of doubt hit him. Why had he stopped, even for a second? He could have just driven past. The beggar wasn't his problem. He didn't have time for distractions. His phone buzzed again, and this time, Victor snatched it up from the passenger seat. The bright screen illuminated the words from his assistant. 10 minutes left. They're waiting. Victor barely registered the message when something shifted on the edge of his vision. A dark figure moving on the sidewalk, closer than before. The beggar and the baby. Victor's stomach churned as he noticed the beggar stumbling, nearly tripping over his own feet, the baby still held tightly in his arms. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met through the rain, and something passed between them. Pity, disgust. Victor wasn't sure. He swerved to avoid a large puddle and accelerated, determined to leave the moment behind him. But as he drove away, his thoughts grew murkier, tangled with a creeping sense of guilt. He had known hunger once. He had felt the cold bite of rain without a roof over his head. And yet, here he was, insulated by wealth, power, and the warmth of his luxury car, watching someone else suffer through what he had worked so hard to escape. Victor glanced at the clock again. 7 minutes. And then, his phone rang. Instinctively, Victor reached for the device, but as he did, something slipped from his jacket pocket. His wallet hit the floor, unnoticed, as he answered the call. The conversation was brief, a confirmation that everything was in place for the meeting. Victor responded mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He didn't notice the wallet that now lay between his seat and the car door, just as he didn't notice the beggar slowing his steps as the car passed by. The man stopped, peering down at the street. Rain dripped from his tattered coat as his eyes caught the faint gleam of something shiny on the pavement where Victor's car had been. With trembling hands, the beggar reached down and picked it up. A wallet, thick with cash and cards. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time Tom, the beggar, stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the wallet in his hand. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was holding. The leather was worn, but still luxurious, heavy with cash and credit cards. The glint of a sleek, metallic card caught his eye, and his heart raced. He turned it over, wiping the rainwater from its surface. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped it open to reveal the name embossed on a sleek business card tucked inside. Victor West. The name sounded vaguely familiar. It must have been someone important, someone who could easily afford to lose a wallet like this. Tom looked down at the baby cradled in his arms, shivering beneath the thin blanket. His son whimpered softly, too young to understand the cold reality they were living in. The sight of his child snapped Tom back to his own bleak reality. He had nothing, no food, no shelter, no money. Every day was a battle for survival, and tonight, with the cold seeping into his bones, the temptation to keep the wallet gnawed at him like hunger. He hadn't eaten since the morning. His son had barely managed a few sips of the diluted formula he had scrounged from a nearby charity. He stared at the cash. It could solve so many of his problems. With this money, he could feed his son, find a warm place to sleep, even plan for something better. Yet, something inside him held him back. Tom had always lived by a simple principle. No matter how tough things got, he wouldn't steal. It was the one thing he could still hold on to, the one thing that separated him from complete despair. But as the rain dripped off his hood, soaking his clothes even further, Tom's resolve wavered. He glanced around, half expecting someone to come rushing after the car, looking for the wallet. The street was empty, save for the occasional pedestrian hurrying past, oblivious to the man and his baby standing alone in the shadows. He hesitated, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflict. Keep it, and he could survive another day, maybe more. Return it, and he'd go back to nothing. His stomach growled in protest as the baby stirred against his chest, reminding him of the stakes. He closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over him, as if the downpour could cleanse the decision he was about to make. But no matter how hard he tried, the idea of stealing felt wrong. He opened his eyes and glanced back at the wallet. Victor West, whoever he was, wouldn't even notice the loss, would he? And yet, the thought of taking it felt like crossing a line Tom wasn't sure he could return from. The baby's soft cry broke through his thoughts, and Tom knew he couldn't stand out in the rain any longer. With a heavy sigh, he pocketed the wallet, determined to figure out what to do with it in the morning. Victor sat in the conference room, his fingers drumming impatiently on the glass table as his business partners went over last-minute details for the deal. His mind, however, was still tangled with the image of the beggar and the baby in the rain. He hadn't been able to shake the discomfort that had settled in his chest since the encounter. It was strange. After all the years he had spent climbing to the top, pushing past every obstacle in his path, why did something so insignificant keep bothering him? His assistant tapped lightly on the door, breaking his reverie. "Victor, we're about to start. You good?" Victor nodded, but his mind wasn't fully there. He checked his watch, calculating how much time he had before the meeting was set to begin. Everything was running on schedule, yet something felt off. As the discussions around him continued, Victor's thoughts drifted further back to a time before the meetings and the suits, before the million-dollar deals. Back when he was just another kid in the streets, scrambling to survive. He had grown up in a part of town that people like his current colleagues would never set foot in. a forgotten neighborhood where dreams were rare and hope was even rarer. Victor had watched his parents struggle day after day, working 2, sometimes 3 jobs to put food on the table. He had known hunger, had seen his mother cry over unpaid bills, and his father come home too exhausted to do more than collapse into a chair. Victor's childhood had been defined by the constant fear of losing everything. But he had vowed early on that his life would be different. He wouldn't end up like them, scraping by, always one bad break away from disaster. No, Victor had clawed his way out, using his ambition and cunning to build a life far removed from the one he had been born into. But as much as he had tried to bury that past, tonight's encounter had stirred something long forgotten. The sight of the beggar had triggered memories he thought he had left behind. He had been in those shoes once, desperate, alone, on the edge of hopelessness. And now, here he was at the top, watching from behind a glass wall. His phone buzzed, breaking him out of his thoughts. A reminder from his assistant flashed on the screen. Meeting starts in 5 minutes. Victor took a deep breath, trying to refocus. He was no longer that kid from the streets. He was Victor West, a millionaire with everything to lose. Yet, as he looked out at the city skyline through the rain-streaked windows, the world outside felt cold and distant, just like the man he had become. Victor adjusted his tie and leaned back in his chair, trying to push the lingering thoughts of his past out of his mind. The meeting had started, but he found it hard to concentrate. The board members were discussing market trends, mergers, and potential growth strategies, things that should have kept his mind sharp. Instead, his focus was scattered. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a reminder or message. It was a feeling, a gnawing sense that something was off. He reached into his jacket pocket, feeling for his wallet, and his heart skipped a beat when he didn't find it. His fingers fumbled, searching both sides of the jacket, but it was gone. He sat up straighter, trying not to draw attention to himself. He patted his pockets again, this time slower, more deliberately. Nothing. The wallet wasn't there. Panic began to creep in as Victor realized the implications. His wallet wasn't just a collection of cash and credit cards. It held everything: his IDs, personal documents, and most importantly, sensitive details related to the deal being discussed in the very room he was sitting in. If that information were lost or, worse, in the wrong hands, it could derail the entire merger. His mind raced. Where could it have gone? He had it when he left the house. He distinctly remembered putting it in his pocket as he got into the car. The car. His heart sank as he recalled the encounter with the beggar. Could it have fallen out when he slammed on the brakes? Did that man pick up? Victor's stomach turned. He didn't want to believe it. The beggar looked desperate enough. Would he take wallet? Would he try to use the cards? The thought made him queasy. "Victor, your thoughts on the projections for next quarter?" one of the partners asked, snapping him back to the present. He blinked, trying to hide his growing anxiety. Yes, well, the projections look solid," he managed to stammer, his mind elsewhere. "But we should consider potential setbacks in the European market." The others nodded, seemingly satisfied with his vague response. But Victor knew he was losing control. He couldn't focus. His entire career hinged on this deal, and now he was distracted by a missing wallet and a memory he couldn't shake. He glanced at the clock. The meeting still had another hour to go, but Victor's mind was already racing toward a solution. Should he leave the meeting and try to find a wallet? Should he call someone? He didn't want to raise alarm, but if that wallet was in the hands of the wrong person, he could lose everything. For the first time in years, Victor felt like that scared kid again, the one who had nothing, who had everything to lose. Tom sat on a damp bench beneath an overpass, holding the wallet in his trembling hands. The baby had finally fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling under the ragged blanket. The wallet felt heavy, not just in weight, but in what it represented. His mind swirled with indecision. He opened it again, counting the bills for what felt like the 100th time. There was enough money in there to feed him and his son for weeks, maybe even longer if he was careful. And it wasn't just the cash. The cards inside, the shiny platinum credit cards, glimmered with possibilities. He could take them, buy anything he needed. For once, He wouldn't have to worry about where the next meal would come from. But there was another part of him, quieter but stronger, that recoiled at the thought. Taking this man's money, using those cards, would be theft. And that was a line Tom had promised himself he would never cross. No matter how desperate he became, he wouldn't steal. He'd already lost so much, his job, his home, his dignity. But he still had his integrity. At least, that's what he told himself. But tonight was different. Tonight, the cold bit deeper. The hunger gnawed harder. He had to make a choice soon, before the guilt or the temptation drove him mad. The rain had let up, leaving the city in a foggy, damp silence. Tom stared out at the empty street, thinking back to how his life had fallen apart. Not long ago, he'd had a job, a decent apartment, and a future he could believe in. But that was before everything crumbled. The layoffs, the medical bills, the loss of his wife. One thing after another, until he found himself here, holding his son close, fighting the urge to break the one rule he had left. He could still return the wallet. Maybe the man wouldn't even notice it was gone. Maybe he would be grateful. Or maybe he would be angry. Think Tom had stolen something. The risks played out in Tom's mind like a movie, each scenario worse than the last. He had no idea who this Victor West was, only that the man clearly had more money than he knew what to do with. But that didn't matter. Tom knew what he had to do. With a sigh, he looked down at his son, still sleeping peacefully. He couldn't let his boy grow up thinking it was okay to take what wasn't theirs, no matter how desperate they were. It wasn't right. Tom had lost so much already, but he refused to lose his sense of what was right. He pocketed the wallet again, his decision made. Tomorrow, he would find a way to return it. He didn't know how, but he would figure it out. For now, he just needed to get through the night. The meeting dragged on, but Victor's mind was anywhere but in the room. His eyes occasionally flicked to the clock, watching the minutes slip away. His palms felt clammy, and his breath was shallow. The missing wallet weighed heavily on his thoughts, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt his stomach churn. How could he have been so careless? If anyone got their hands on the information inside, it would be disastrous, not just for him, but for the company. He tried to focus on the conversations swirling around him, but every time he glanced at the empty chair beside him where his assistant usually sat, the anxiety gnawed harder. As the board members debated strategies for expansion, Victor excused himself, standing quickly and offering a vague explanation about needing to make an urgent call. The lie tumbled out smoothly, but his insides were in turmoil. He exited the room, pulling out his phone the moment he was alone in the hallway. He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a quick message to his assistant. Lost my wallet. Might have dropped it near the car. Call security to check. A few seconds later, a reply buzzed back. On it. We'll let you know if we find anything. Victor let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He still felt uneasy, but at least he had taken some action. Maybe someone had picked up and turned it in already. Maybe everything would be fine. But as much as he tried to reassure himself, the image of the beggar in the rain refused to leave his mind. Could it have been him? Victor shook his head. He didn't want to believe that, but he couldn't shake the possibility. There was something in the beggar's eyes, something that hinted at a desperation Victor recognized all too well. He had seen it in the mirror many years ago, when he was clawing his way out of poverty. The thought unsettled him. He had left that life behind for good, or so he thought. Yet now, standing alone in the hallway of a towering glass building, the life he had worked so hard to forget seemed to be catching up with him. His phone buzzed again. Security is looking. No sign of the wallet yet. Victor cursed under his breath. Time was running out, and his nerves were wearing thin. He didn't have the luxury of waiting around. He needed to find that wallet before things spiraled further out of control. He turned back toward the conference room, determined to finish the meeting and deal with the fallout later. But a knot of unease tightened in his chest. He had a feeling that this was far from over. The next morning, Tom stood outside the gleaming office building, clutching the wallet in his hand. He had barely slept. The night had been cold, and the temptation to keep the wallet had gnawed at him. But he had made his decision. Returning it was the only option he could live with. His son stirred in his arms, bundled in the same ragged blanket that had kept them both warm through the night. Tom wasn't sure what kind of reception he'd get once he walked inside. He imagined the security guards throwing him out before he even got a word in. After all, what kind of person would believe that a homeless man with a baby would return a wallet stuffed with cash and cards? But Tom had to try. He couldn't keep it, and he wouldn't allow his son to grow up thinking stealing was the way to survive. With a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the wallet and headed toward the entrance. The lobby was as intimidating as he had imagined. Cold, polished marble floors, towering columns, and sharp-dressed people moving with purpose. Tom felt out of place more than ever before. His worn clothes, soaked from the drizzle outside, stood in stark contrast to the pristine suits and heels clicking on the floor around him. He adjusted his grip on his son, who looked around with wide, curious eyes, seemingly oblivious to the tension building in his father. Tom hesitated, glancing at the reception desk. How was he even supposed to get to this Victor West? He didn't belong here. For a moment, he considered turning around, leaving the wallet behind, and disappearing into the streets again. But then, the weight of his decision settled on his shoulders. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He approached the desk, swallowing his nerves. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice rough from lack of sleep. The woman at the desk looked up, her gaze cool and professional. "I need to speak to Victor West," Tom stammered, holding out the wallet as proof. "This is his. I found it." Her expression softened, though her eyes still held a hint of suspicion. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No, but it's important. I found his wallet, and I just wanted to return it." The receptionist glanced at the wallet in Tom's hand, then at the baby nestled against his chest. After a long moment, she nodded. "Wait here," she said, picking up the phone and dialing an extension. Tom's heart pounded as he stood there, waiting. The seconds dragged on, and he wondered what Victor would think when he saw him again. Would he believe him, or would he accuse Tom of trying to steal? The sound of footsteps approaching pulled Tom out of his thoughts. He turned to see a tall figure coming toward him, Victor West. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, neither of them moved. Victor's gaze shifted from Tom to the wallet and back again. The expression on his face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that Tom hadn't seen the night before recognition. Tom stepped forward, extending the wallet. "I found this. Thought you might want it back." Victor stood still for a moment, then slowly reached out and took the wallet from Tom's hand. His fingers brushed against the worn leather, and his mind raced with questions. He glanced down at the baby, then back at Tom. "You returned it," Victor said, his voice quiet, almost disbelieving. Tom shrugged, his expression tired but sincere. "Yeah, it didn't feel right to keep it." Victor looked down at the wallet, then at Tom, struggling to process the situation. Something shifted inside him. He had spent his entire life building walls between himself and the world he had left behind. But now, standing in front of this man, this stranger who had once been part of the life he had escaped, those walls didn't seem so impenetrable anymore. Victor stood motionless, the wallet heavy in his hand as he stared at Tom. There was a familiarity in the man's face, something beyond just the encounter in the rain. For a moment, time seemed to slow as recognition dawned. "Could it be you?" Victor began, his voice barely a whisper. "I know you, don't I?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, pulling his son closer as if bracing for whatever would come next. His eyes met Victor's, and there it was, confirmation. Victor's memory flashed back, further than he had allowed himself to go in years. He had known this man, or at least a version of him, back when they were both just starting out, clawing their way into the working world. Years ago, before the suits, the wealth, and the boardroom deals, Victor had worked at a small firm, scraping by, doing whatever it took to stay afloat. And Tom had been there too. They hadn't been close friends, but they had known each other well enough. Tom had been quiet, a hard worker, and kind to a fault. He remembered how Tom had once helped him out when he was in a tight spot, back when they were both still struggling to find their way. I didn't realize it was you, Victor finally said, the words hanging in the air like a confession. It's been years. Tom offered a faint smile, though his eyes were tired. Yeah, it's been a long time. Victor's mind raced. He hadn't thought about those days in forever. He had left that life behind so completely that he had forgotten the faces of those who had been a part of it. Seeing Tom here, now, like this, on the edge of survival, holding a baby, was a harsh reminder of how close they had once been to sharing the same fate. I never expected, Victor trailed off, not knowing how to finish the thought. He never expected to see Tom like this, and certainly not to be handed back his own wallet by a man who clearly had so little to his name. Tom shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. Look, I didn't come here for anything. I just wanted to return what was yours. I saw it fall when you drove off last night, and I couldn't keep it. Victor nodded slowly, his mind still processing the flood of memories. You could have kept it. No one would have known. Tom gave a small, weary shrug. Maybe, but I would have known. That simple statement hit Victor harder than he expected. The honesty, the integrity, the moral line that Tom had refused to cross despite his circumstances. It was something Victor hadn't encountered in a long time. In his world, everyone was looking for an edge, for a way to get ahead, no matter the cost. But here was Tom, standing in front of him with nothing but his principles he had somehow managed to hold onto despite everything. Victor felt a pang of guilt. How long had it been since he had lived by those same values? Since he had been the kind of person who cared about doing the right thing rather than just the profitable thing? He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling exposed. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you for this. Tom shook his head. I don't need anything from you, Victor. I just want to do the right thing. But Victor wasn't so sure. Tom didn't say outright, but the weight of his struggle was evident in his posture, in the dark circles under his eyes. He couldn't just walk away from this. Not again. The ride back to the office was silent. Victor sat in the back seat of his luxury sedan, staring at the wallet resting on his lap. The rain had started again, light but steady, tapping against the windows as the city passed by in a blur. He barely noticed the familiar streets or the people huddled under umbrellas. His mind was elsewhere. For the first time in a long time, Victor was forced to confront the choices that had led him here. He had always told himself that his success had come from hard work, from making the right decisions, from seizing opportunities. And while all that was true, today had reminded him of the other side of that coin, the choices he hadn't made, the people he had left behind, the ones who hadn't been as fortunate. Tom's face lingered in his thoughts, and with it came a flood of memories from the early days, when both of them were young, hungry, and full of hope. Back then, they had been on the same path, working long hours, living paycheck to paycheck, dreaming of something better. But somewhere along the way, their lives had diverged, and Victor had never looked back. Until now, he had built walls around himself, walls of wealth, power, and success. But Tom's appearance, standing there in those soaked, worn-out clothes, with a baby clutched to his chest, had cracked those walls. Victor had spent years distancing himself from his past, pretending that it had no bearing on his present. But now he couldn't ignore it anymore. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was his assistant, updating him on the progress of the meeting he had left earlier. Everything was proceeding as planned, the merger was on track, and soon enough, he would be signing off on one of the biggest deals of his career. Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. It should have felt like a victory. After all, this was what he had worked for. This was what all the long hours and hard choices had been about. But now, in the aftermath of seeing Tom again, it fell hollow. What was it all worth if he had to leave behind the values he once held dear? If he had to turn a blind eye to the people who had helped him along the way? The ones who hadn't been as lucky? He thought back to the way Tom had spoken. So simple, so honest. I just wanted to do the right thing. The words echoed in Victor's mind, growing louder with each passing minute. As the car pulled up to his office, Victor made a decision. He couldn't just return to business as usual. Not this time. Tom had done more than just return his wallet. He had returned something that Victor hadn't realized he had lost: a sense of connection to the world outside his bubble of wealth and success. He stepped out of the car, the rain washing over him in a cool, steady stream. The towering glass building loomed above, a monument to everything he had built. But now, it didn't feel like enough. There was more to be done, more than just signing deals and closing mergers. He had the power to change things, to help people like Tom, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like that was something worth pursuing. Victor stood for a moment, letting the rain soak into his expensive suit, before heading inside. Victor sat behind his expansive desk, the city skyline stretching out beyond the glass windows behind him. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside bathed in a muted glow of early morning light. But inside his office, the weight of yesterday's events still lingered heavily on his mind. He tapped his fingers on the polished wood, staring at the wallet that now rested beside his phone. Every time he looked at it, he saw Tom's face, tired, worn, but still carrying an air of dignity that hadn't wavered despite his circumstances. Victor couldn't stop thinking about it. How could someone who had nothing hold on to so much integrity while he, with everything, had long forgotten what that even felt like? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. His assistant poked her head in, clipboard in hand. "You have a call with the board in 5 minutes. Everything's set for the merger signing." Victor nodded absent-mindedly, his mind still elsewhere. "Thanks," he muttered, glancing out the window as she disappeared from view. His eyes were drawn to the streets below, where people bustled about, oblivious to the thoughts running through his head. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Tom." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a hesitant, "Victor?" Victor took a breath. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about everything really, and I realized that I can't just leave things as they are." He could almost hear Tom's confusion through the phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to help. I know you didn't ask for anything, but I can't just pretend I didn't see what I saw. I can't ignore the fact that our paths diverged so drastically when they could have easily gone the other way." Victor paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I want to offer you a job, a chance to get back on your feet, to start over." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Victor wondered if Tom had hung up. Then, slowly, Tom spoke. "A job?" "Yes, something stable. I don't expect you to accept right away, but I think it could be a good opportunity for you to get out of the situation you're in. For your son, too." Victor's heart pounded as he waited for Tom's response. He wasn't sure how Tom would react, or if he'd even consider the offer. But after what he had seen, Victor knew he couldn't just turn his back on the man he had once known. Finally, Tom sighed. I don't know what to say. I wasn't expecting this." Victor nodded, even though Tom couldn't see him. "Just think about it. Take your time. I'm not asking for a decision right now, but I wanted to extend the offer. You deserve a second chance, Tom." Another pause. "Thank you, Victor. I'll think about it." They exchanged a few more words before hanging up, leaving Victor staring at the phone in his hand, wondering what Tom's decision would be. He didn't know what would come of this, but he knew that extending this offer had shifted something in him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something beyond profit and success. Tom stood outside the modest apartment complex, staring at the piece of paper in his hand. It had been a week since Victor had made the offer, and after countless sleepless nights of deliberation, Tom had decided to take him up on it. It hadn't been an easy decision. Accepting help, especially from someone like Victor, felt like admitting defeat. Tom had always prided himself on being able to stand on his own, even when things were at their worst. But the reality of his situation, caring for his son, barely scraping by, had forced him to reconsider. This wasn't just about him anymore. His son deserved better, and if this job could provide that, maybe it was time to swallow his pride. He shifted his son in his arms and took a deep breath. The baby had been his anchor through all of this, the one thing keeping him grounded. Every decision Tom made now was for him, for a future that he hadn't been able to see before Victor's offer. He had been given an address, and a time for his first day at the job. Victor had arranged everything: housing, transportation, and even daycare for the baby. It felt surreal, like a dream he hadn't realized he'd had until it was handed to him. And though part of him still felt wary, wondering what the catch was, another part of him, the part that had spent years battling the cold realities of street, felt something like hope. The building was quiet as he stepped inside, the lobby clean but unassuming, a far cry from the towering glass offices Victor worked in. This was a place for starting over, for rebuilding. Tom approached the front desk, his nerves buzzing. "I'm Tom. I was told to come here for my first day." The receptionist smiled warmly. "Of course, we've been expecting you. You'll meet with Mr. West first. He's just down the hall." Tom nodded, swallowing his anxiety as he made his way down the hallway. His thoughts raced. What was he supposed to say? How was he supposed to feel about this? He had always been independent, had fought tooth and nail to survive. And now, he was walking into an opportunity that felt like a lifeline. At the end of the hall, Victor stood waiting. His demeanor was more relaxed than it had been before, less of the rigid businessman and more of the man Tom had once known, years ago. There was something different about him now, something that hadn't been there during their first encounter in the rain. "Tom," Victor greeted him with a nod. "I'm glad you came." Tom shifted the baby on his hip and offered a small smile. "I wasn't sure I would, to be honest." Victor gestured to the office behind him. "Come on in. Let's talk." As they entered the room, Tom felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This wasn't just a job. It was the beginning of something new. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a real shot at changing it. Victor sat in his office, the city buzzing below, yet for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the numbers or the deals. His thoughts were centered on something else, something far more personal. The decision to extend an offer to Tom had opened a door Victor hadn't even realized he'd closed long ago. It wasn't just about helping a man he once knew. It was about rediscovering a part of himself that he had locked away in his pursuit of success. Tom had accepted the job, and though the transition was still fresh, Victor could see the relief and determination in his old acquaintance's eyes. Tom hadn't asked for pity or handouts. He had accepted the opportunity with quiet dignity, just as he had returned the wallet, honestly and without expectation. That had struck Victor deeply. He had built his empire on the idea that people were only out for themselves, and success came from outmaneuvering others. But Tom's actions, his integrity in the face of hardship, had reminded Victor of a truth he had long forgotten. Success wasn't just measured in financial gain, but in the ability to remain true to oneself, even when life dealt you a bad hand. Victor leaned back in his chair, staring out at the sprawling cityscape. He had everything he had ever wanted: money, power, and status. But had it all come at a cost? His thoughts wandered back to when he had first started out, hungry and desperate to make a name for himself. Somewhere along the way, he had sacrificed his values for ambition, and he hadn't even realized it until now. Tom's return had been a wake-up call. It wasn't just the wallet. It was what the wallet represented. A choice between right and wrong, between taking the easy way out or doing the honorable thing. Tom had made the harder choice, and in doing so, had earned not just Victor's respect, but a reminder of what truly mattered. Victor's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant. "The merger is officially signed. Congratulations." He stared at the message for a long moment, the usual sense of accomplishment missing. The deal had been closed, but Victor felt no celebration, no surge of pride. Instead, he thought of Tom, of the decisions he had been forced to make to survive. The merger was just another deal in a long line of them, but what Victor had gained from reconnecting with Tom was something far more valuable: a renewed perspective. Victor stood and crossed the room to his bookshelf, running his hand over the spines of books that had shaped his rise in the business world. For the first time in a long while, he realized that maybe it wasn't just about winning the next deal. Maybe it was about making sure the people who had helped him along the way didn't get left behind. The merger was done. The papers were signed. But something much more important had started. Tom stood in the small office Victor had given him, his hands resting on the desk as he took in his surroundings. It wasn't much, just a simple room with a desk, a chair, and a computer. But to Tom, it felt like the first step toward rebuilding his life. The job Victor had offered was humble, an entry-level position, but it was enough. More than enough. It had been a whirlwind week of adjustments, both for him and his son. Daycare had been arranged, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, Tom didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from. The weight of survival had lifted, if only slightly, and with it came a cautious sense of hope. Tom sat down at the desk, his son's picture already propped up in the corner. He had hesitated to accept Victor's offer at first, his pride getting in the way. But in the end, he had realized that this was about more than just him. His son needed stability, and Tom was determined to give it to him. No more nights on the streets, no more begging for scraps. This job, this opportunity, was his chance to provide a future he had once feared was out of reach. The door creaked open, and Victor stepped inside, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "How's the first day treating you?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. Tom smiled, glancing around the office. "Feels strange, to be honest, but good. Feels like I'm finally getting somewhere." Victor nodded, his gaze drifting toward the photo of Tom's son. "I'm glad you accepted the offer. I know it wasn't easy for you." Tom met his gaze. "It wasn't, but I've come to realize that sometimes we can't do it all on our own. I've spent too long trying to survive on pride. It's time I let that go. For his sake." Victor pushed off the doorframe, walking farther into the room. "I think we both learned something in the past week. For what it's worth, I'm glad we ran into each other again." Tom chuckled softly. "I don't know if I'd call it luck, but yet me too." There was a brief, comfortable silence between them, the kind that comes with shared understanding. Victor hadn't just given Tom a job. He had given him a second chance, a chance to prove that he was still the man he once had been, capable of building something more than just surviving. And for Victor, it was more than just a gesture of goodwill. It was a step toward becoming the man he had always wanted to be, one who didn't forget the people who had helped him along the way. "Let me know if you need anything," Victor said, breaking the silence. "My door's always open." Tom nodded, watching as Victor turned to leave. "Thank you, Victor, for everything." Victor paused at the door, giving a slight nod. "It's the least I could do." As Victor left, Tom sat back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the window where sunlight was filtering through the blinds. For the first time in a long while, Tom felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, building a future for himself and his son. And with this new beginning, he finally believed that maybe, just maybe, things would be different. Victor stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, staring out at the city skyline as the late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon. The lights of the city flickered on one by one, painting the streets in a soft, golden glow. Normally, he would be focused on the next deal, the next opportunity, but today, his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought of Tom, of the journey they had both been on, parallel lives that had diverged and then crossed again in the most unexpected of ways. The man who had once been a quiet colleague, someone Victor had barely known, had become the catalyst for his own self-reflection and growth. Victor had always measured his success in terms of wealth and power, but his interactions with Tom had reminded him that there was more to life than the endless pursuit of financial gain. He had spent years building walls around himself, shielding himself from the struggles of the people he had left behind. But now, those walls were starting to crumble, and for the first time, Victor welcomed the change. He had already begun making adjustments in his life. Small steps, but important ones. He had implemented new policies at his company, policies that ensured that people like Tom, those who had fallen on hard times, had a second chance to rebuild. He had reconnected with old friends, people he hadn't spoken to in years, and had even started looking into charitable work, something he had always thought he'd get to later. But more than that, Victor had changed internally. His priorities had shifted. The endless drive for success no longer felt like the sole purpose of his life. He had begun to see the value in human connection, in empathy, in doing what was right even when it wasn't profitable. And it had all started with a chance encounter in the rain, a moment that had forced him to look beyond himself and see the world through different eyes. Victor's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant. The press conference is starting in 30 minutes. Are you ready? He smiled to himself, glancing down at the phone. Today wasn't just about closing another deal or signing another contract. It was about announcing a new initiative, a foundation Victor had set up to provide resources for people like Tom, those who needed a second chance. It was a small step in the grand scheme of things, but for Victor, it was monumental. It was proof that he had changed, that he was no longer the man who had once walked past a beggar in the rain without a second thought. He typed a quick reply, "I'm on my way." Victor grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, feeling lighter than he had in years. This was a new chapter, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt like they had been left behind. Tom walked through the doors of his new apartment, the warmth of the small space immediately wrapping around him and his son. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't luxurious, but it was more than he had dared hope for a few months ago. It was home. His son giggled in his arms, reaching for the colorful toys scattered across the floor, things Tom had been able to afford thanks to his new job and the stability that came with it. It was still surreal sometimes, waking up in a bed with a roof over his head, knowing that the day ahead would be spent working, earning, and providing for his child. It felt like a dream he had almost given up on before Victor had come back into his life. He set his son down on the soft carpet, watching as the baby explored the room with wide, curious eyes. Tom couldn't help but smile. This was everything he had ever wanted, a chance to give his child a life free from the struggles that had defined Tom's own existence for so long. He didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from, or if they would have a place to sleep. They were safe. They were home. The knock on the door came just as Tom sat down on the couch, and for a brief moment, a flash of his old life, one filled with uncertainty and fear, rushed through him. But that fear quickly faded as he remembered where he was now. He opened the door to find Victor standing there, a warm smile on his face. "Thought I'd check in and see how you were doing," Victor said, stepping inside. Tom chuckled. "We're doing good. Better than good, actually." Victor looked around the apartment, taking in the space. "I'm glad to hear that." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on how much had changed since that rainy night when their paths had crossed once again. For Tom, it was a chance at a new life. For Victor, it was the realization that success meant more than just wealth. It meant helping others find their way too. "You've done a lot for me, Victor," Tom said quietly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Victor shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Tom. In fact, I should be thanking you. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, that there's more to life than what we see from the top." Tom smiled. "I guess we've both learned a lot." They sat down together, the sound of Tom's son playing in the background, filling the room with laughter. It was a moment of peace, of connection, of understanding between two men who had come from different worlds but had found their way back to each other. "I started a foundation," Victor said after a while, his voice thoughtful. "It's for people like you, people who need a second chance. It's still in the early stages, but I think it could really help a lot of people." Tom's eyes widened in surprise. "A foundation? That's amazing, Victor." Victor shrugged modestly. "It's a small step, but it feels right. And I wanted you to know that you were the inspiration behind it." Tom was silent for a moment, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Victor replied. "Just keep doing what you're doing, taking care of yourself and your son. That's all the thanks I need." They sat in comfortable silence after that, two men who had once been strangers but were now bound by something deeper. Their lives had changed, their paths had realigned, and together they had found a way forward. For Tom, it was the start of a new life. For Victor, it was the beginning of a new purpose. And for both of them, it was proof that sometimes second chances could lead to something even greater than they had ever imagined. If you enjoyed The Lost Wallet and want to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us keep creating content that resonates with you. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what part of the story impacted you the most. Was it the powerful reunion between Victor and Tom, the lessons about second chances, or something else? We're curious to know what moved you. Also, feel free to leave suggestions for future stories you'd like to see on the channel. Whether it's about redemption, unlikely friendships, or any other theme, your ideas could inspire the next big story. Thanks for being part of this journey. Your support means the world to us.